Pokémon is one of the greatest video game franchises of all time, with best-selling games releasing for over 2 decades.
But how did we get here? How did a franchise with such a simple concept of catching monsters and making them fight each other capture the hearts of people across the world?
Well, like many great games, it started from humble beginnings. It all began with Satoshi Tajiri, current president and co-founder of Game Freak. As a child, he grew up in the once rural city of Machida, a region of Tokyo that was progressing toward a more urban design. Tajiri used to enjoy the hobby of bug catching and even wanted to be an entomologist when he grew up. As the urban progression of Tokyo spread into Machida, many of the habitats for bug catching were replaced by pavement. And just as the city changed, Tajiri changed as well. When fishing ponds became arcades, his hobby went from bug catching to gaming. Eventually, after many hours spent in the arcade, he gained a new desire to become a game developer. He took apart his Famicom system to learn how it worked, and then at the age of 16, won a contest held by Sega to sponsor a new game idea. It took 2 years to learn programming and then another to release his first game called Quinty. But before he even released his first game, he had started his own magazine called Game Freak. Due to the severe lack of gaming media, he was able to fill a gap in the market and gain popularity. One of its readers, Ken Sugimori, contacted Tajiri and eventually became the magazine's illustrator. After a few years, Game Freak magazine was a respected part of Japan's gaming media culture. With Tajiri's new respect in the industry, he gradually built up a team of like-minded individuals such as Tsunekazu Ishihara, current president of the Pokémon Company, and Junichi Masuda, former composer at Game Freak and current creative director at the Pokémon Company. With his team assembled, he began his first game development startup, also named Game Freak. From here, they worked on their first game Quinty, which was published by Namco. At this point, Tajiri officially incorporated Game Freak. Around this time, Tajiri had already begun thinking about his next game idea. Nintendo had announced their newest system, being the Game Boy. This was a handheld console that the world had never seen the likes of before. One aspect of it in particular interested Tajiri, being the link cable. The reason? Well, this cable would allow you to transfer things from one cartridge to another. Games like Tetris could use this cable for competing against each other, but Tajiri saw a vision of something greater. He remembered what he used to do with his friends as a child with bugs, and then this turned into the initial inspiration for Pokémon. Additionally, when he was playing a game called Dragon Quest II, he had an experience where he wanted to get a rare item, but the enemy it came from was not dropping it. Ken Sugimori, Tajiri's close friend and illustrator at Game Freak, was also playing the game and acquired 2 of these rare items. Unfortunately, the Famicom did not have the capability of trading, so when he saw the link cable, the vision of what we know as trading Pokemon today was sparked. Besides trading Pokemon, he and his team felt inspired by tokusatsu and kaiju media. One in particular had a lot of these monsters that were stored inside of capsules. As you can probably assume, this became the idea of storing Pokemon in Pokeballs. The final major concept in the game, battling, was a bit of a necessary evil in Tajiri's eyes. While including battling made the game a lot more fun and even a bit of a stress reliever, he didn't want Pokemon to bleed or die in battle, hence the term faint being used. His goal was not to fill the gaming world with any pointless violence, and considering this game's whole concept was based on his childhood, it was likely an inclusion that required a lot of thought before adding.
And so the team began work on Project Capsule Monsters, but there was just one problem. It could not be trademarked because of the regulations in Japan, so what they did was change the name to Pocket Monsters, which would eventually be shortened to the name we know today, Pokémon.
For the initial release of games in Japan, they used the name Pocket Monsters. However, for the sake of brevity, I'll just say Pokémon.
Anyway, a great idea is nothing without the ability to get it off the ground. And fortunately, there was one man who had the connections that would prove to be life-changing at Game Freak.
Tsunekazu Ishihara was able to connect Tajiri with Nintendo's affiliated company Ape. After a few connections and Tajiri pitching his game, the president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, heard about the idea and reportedly said, "This is it. This is the idea I've been waiting for." While Ishihara was certainly connected to Tajiri, he had not actually been as close as the other members of Game Freak. In fact, he had been working at Ape on a very similar idea as Pokémon. Game Freak and Ape decided to combine their ideas and get started working on the game. At the time though, Ape had already been working on Earthbound, so Tajiri decided it would be best to handle the development within Game Freak. While the extended Ape development team was not involved nor credited for the game, Ishihara still helped produce the game, managing basically everything that was required outside outside of the literal development. Most importantly, he kept that crucial connection with Nintendo. While Nintendo gave Game Freak a pitifully low budget, they tried their best to make it work. Making this game was a long and arduous process, and eventually they moved their focus onto other games. This doesn't mean they gave up though, and after the release of their game Pulseman, Tajiri got the drive to get back on the horse of Pokémon. Aside from their team all contributing to the game, Tajiri became acquainted with Shigeru Miyamoto, who he described as a mentor figure for him. The extent to which Miyamoto was actually involved isn't exactly clear, but what we do know is that he gave Tajiri the idea for the different versions of the game, and well, if you think about it, this piece of guidance probably made Game Freak a ridiculous amount of money in the long term. But as Pokémon Red and Green were nearing completion, there was a very unique business move that is something almost no company would ever do. Pokémon's ownership was spread across 3 different entities: Game Freak, Creatures, and Nintendo. Game Freak was of course controlled by Tajiri, but Creatures was actually taken up by Ishihara, who grew a strong passion for Pokémon while he was helping produce it. Today, we know this co-ownership of Pokémon as the Pokémon Company. In December 1995, Pokémon Red and Green was finally complete, and in February 1996, they were released to the public. Surprisingly, these games were never expected to be that successful. This was due to the Game Boy already being on the decline in popularity, with it being about 7 years old at this point. Fortunately, Nintendo had coincidentally come out with a new Game Boy Pocket, which certainly did help Pokémon. The game's initial release was slow, but improved after extensive promotion in the media, especially magazines. Later in the year, they released a special version of the game called Pokémon Blue, which was a special edition only for subscribers of CoroCoro Comic. In this special version, made to celebrate 1 million sales of Red and Green, there were bug fixes and new sprites. They expected around 300,000 units to be sold, but over double that amount was actually ordered. Thinking about that now, that's kind of insane and just goes to show how dedicated the readers of the magazine were. To create more interest in the game, Tajiri revealed a special Pokémon called Mew. Although it was not intended for players to be able to obtain, later on Mew would actually be distributed through a Nintendo promotional event. But at this point, so many rumors have begun to spread about the supposed ways you could obtain it. There is a way we know that Mew can be glitched into the game, however back then it was all playground rumors.
Now, with Pokemon having been tested in Japan for about a year or 2 at this point, they decided it was finally time to bring it to the rest of the world.
Localizing Pokemon was not an easy endeavor, as all of the names and dialogue would have to be specially translated to make sense to Western audiences. After all, this game is a large celebration of Japanese culture, and many references would simply go over the heads of Westerners if they didn't translate it properly. In 1998, the games Pokemon Red and Blue came out in the USA, and alongside the anime and the trading card game, took over the country. This Pokemania is a moment in gaming history that quite literally might not ever be replicated again. I doubt you'll see a time where a gaming franchise comes to America initially through an anime, which builds hype towards the release of the actual game, which performs amazingly. Then a few months later, a trading card game releases that has all your favorite characters from the game, which you can collect and play with your friends.
But enough about development, let's talk about the game and what it brought to the table.
The game begins with the ever so nostalgic scene of Gengar fighting Nidorino, and then to the title screen with perhaps the most iconic music in the series. Upon starting a new game, you're greeted by Professor Oak, who explains how this world is inhabited by Pokémon and how people interact with them. We choose our name and our rival's name. We start our adventure in Pallet Town in our room, speak to our mother, and then try to walk into the tall grass. Professor Oak stops us and tells us that it isn't safe to go out without a Pokémon. He brings us into his lab, and alongside our rival, we get to choose our starter Pokémon. This choice might seem simple, but the one you choose will likely become a foundational part of how you view Pokémon as a whole. Depending on the Pokemon you choose, your rival will always choose the one with a type advantage. Basically, Pokemon battling is a very advanced game of rock, paper, scissors. The system consists of typical RPG elements such as special moves, levels, and HP, but there's another factor at play called typing. Essentially, there are 15 types in this game, and each has other types they are strong, weak, or neutral against. For example, if you're using the fire-type Pokemon Charizard and the opponent is using a water-type move, you'll receive double the damage the move typically does. Additionally, every Pokemon has 5 different types of stats. HP, Attack, Defense, Special, and Speed. One of these in particular is a bit weird though, that being Special. See, nowadays we have 6 different types of stats, and that's because Special is now split into Special Attack and Defense. In Generation 1 though, they were combined. Whether or not an attack is considered special or physical all depends on the typing of the move. Because remember, not only do Pokemon have types, but so do moves. Later on in the franchise, we would see this evolve into where type doesn't define a move's special or physical identity, but here it does. At first glance, this might not mean much to people, but in reality, this game's battling is completely different from what we see today, and in many cases unfair or downright broken. Regardless, it was still pretty awesome to battle using these Pokemon. The whole idea of the game revolves around taking the Gym Challenge, where you battle 8 different gym leaders and then take on the Elite Four, where you can become the champion of the region. Along the way, you'll encounter Pokemon that you can catch using Pokeballs. How you do this is completely up to you. Some like to brute force their way through the game with only a handful of Pokemon. Others like to take the slogan of gotta catch 'em all literally, and will catch any Pokemon they see. There is no right or wrong way to play this game, and that's in part to why I think it does so well with so many different demographics.
While we could discuss things like the art and the music, there's not much here that could be discussed that won't be talked about later in the video, especially in the section about the controversies, and trust me, there are a lot of them. So stay tuned. For now, let's look at the reception of Pokemon in Japan versus America.
Of course, we know how crazy Pokemania was here in the States, but it was never expected to be like that. See, Pokemon was quite successful in Japan, and that could be attributed to many different reasons. First, its marketing team was like no other. Nintendo at this point was an already established company with decades of experience in the media industry. I would be a fool to not give a lot of the credit to Ishihara though, who for decades has done a phenomenal job at making sure Pokemon stays in the public eye. At the start, the Pokemon company made sure to put their newest franchise on magazines, manga, television, merchandise, movies, and trading cards. Japan had always been into these forms of media, especially when it was centered around the idea of collecting. Aside from the insane advertising job by Ishihara, the art team at the Pokemon Company was just as responsible for the love of the fans. The 2 primary designers, Ken Sugimori and Atsuko Nishida, are responsible for nearly all of the most recognizable Pokemon we know today. Pikachu, Charizard, Eevee. These Pokemon's designs came from the minds of these 2 amazing artists. In Japan specifically, people love cute things, so when Pokemon came out, its success could largely be attributed to how cute these were, outside of the game at least. Furthermore, success with female gamers was much greater than almost any other gaming franchise at the time, which is crazy considering you can't even play as a girl in the original games. This wasn't just a factor in Japan though, this extended all the way to the West. Fortunately for us, there is plenty of archived media to show exactly how Pokemon affected the US. Interestingly enough, many at Nintendo were not faithful that Pokemon would have much success in the West due to the perception that Westerners preferred more sporty and action-packed games. RPGs in general were not as popular outside of Japan, so this expectation was fairly reasonable. There were some believers in the series though. The most important was founder and then president of Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa. Nintendo of America executives had little to no faith in Pokemon in the States, stating that the kids simply did not have the attention span for it. Not to mention how poor Pokemon's graphics were compared to other games at the time on the N64 or PlayStation. Arakawa was not so willing to give up on the game though, and despite efforts from Nintendo to dumb down Pokemon's cuteness, he demanded it be localized faithfully. And I'll tell you what, thank goodness he did. What the executives at Nintendo of America didn't anticipate was that Pokemon wasn't just viewed as cute, but also really cool. There's many different reasons for this, ranging from the animated battles in the anime to the competitive nature in-game and also out of the game with the trading card game. It also helped that Nintendo was able to allocate more than $50 million to advertising at launch. In reality, this was like $100 million in today's money. Upon release, the game sold 200,000 copies in its first month, eventually reaching millions and millions over the years. Besides the games, by December 1998, only about 3 months after the anime's initial release, it became the highest rated syndicated children's show during the weekdays. The trading card game was literally blowing the other trading cards out of the water with its sales, to the point where they literally couldn't print enough cards to fill the demand. This supply and demand issue would actually become a problem beyond just the trading cards, although I feel like this specific topic is so popular because of how highly valued the first print of the base set of Pokemon cards are today. In October of 1999, the sequels to Pokemon Red and Blue, Gold and Silver were already in the works. However, Nintendo had a little something extra planned in the meantime, Pokemon Yellow. The year prior, Nintendo had released this special version of the games where there were changes in the game to reflect the anime storyline a bit more. Things like your starter was changed to be Pikachu, who followed you around in the overworld, and the characters changed to include those from the anime too. In general, there wasn't a major difference in gameplay though. In fact, many argue this is an inferior version of Red and Blue. Regardless, people still happily bought the game and its Game Boy Color bundle, making it the #1 sold game during the holiday season. Eventually, Pokémon released its first movie called Pokémon: The First Movie in the States, which was released in November 1999, which is considered to be the peak of Pokémania. The release of the movie went exceptionally well, becoming one of the highest grossing Japanese animated films of all time. In just its first day on a Wednesday, it made $10 million. I mean, imagine being the accountant back at Nintendo and seeing those kinds of numbers appear on your desk.
With all that being said about Pokémania, it seems like these games brought an air of positivity across the world, and while that is true, it is unfortunately not without many controversies.
Arguably the most popular controversy out there is the infamous Computer Warrior Porygon incident. It was the night of December 16th, 1997, and the anime was airing as usual in Japan. In this particular episode, the cast is taken into a virtual world with a Porygon, and at one point are attacked. In this scene, there is a moment of explosions with red and blue flashes repeatedly swapping. This resulted in many health issues along with some children having seizures. Hundreds of children were brought into hospitals, but fortunately all of them recovered.
This clip is still on YouTube actually, but please do not watch it, because I actually decided to watch it myself and I cannot believe they were allowed to air this on national television.
The aftermath of this resulted in the show going on hiatus, but it did not ultimately damage Pokémon's reputation all that much. Sure, there were plenty of precautions ensuring that the anime would not have something like this happen again, but there wasn't really any loss that happened here. There is something really interesting that I learned about this though. Have you ever noticed in modern anime that in certain scenes, especially fight scenes, that they'll dim the screen? Well, you guessed it, that's because of the Porygon incident. Anyway, Pokémon continued to grow like usual during and beyond the hiatus. Even though this was the most problematic situation stemming from the anime, there actually is a laundry list of moments they had to remove or tweak particularly for American audiences. But while the first season of the anime had plenty of controversies associated with it, what about the games? Well, it's not exactly an angel either. Perhaps the most obvious instance of this was the original design of the Pokémon Jynx. While today this Pokémon's skin is purple, back then Jynx was jet black. And in America, when we see jet black skin, big red lips, and big circular eyes, one can only be reminded of Jim Crow era minstrel performers. When people in America started to notice this Pokémon, some were offended by its suspicious design, and justifiably so. This wasn't the first time America had seen a character like this though, because in the anime Dragon Ball, there was a character named Mr. Popo. I don't fully understand the reason behind designing characters like this, because, well, Jim Crow history is basically unknown outside the United States, let alone Japan, so it's unlikely for them to be inspired by Jim Crow minstrel performers. It's speculated that the design of Jynx stems from an emerging fashion style at the time in Japan, ganguro. This style was characterized by being the complete opposite of Japanese beauty standards. Instead of pale skin, dark hair, and subtle makeup, girls started wearing fake tans, blonde hair, and extravagant makeup. It is important to note that while these girls do look like they are wearing blackface sometimes, this is not the intention. I would wager that if you went back in time and asked these girls if they knew what blackface was, they would be genuinely unaware of what that meant. But this only makes it more confusing to me as to how Nintendo could have possibly designed Jynx after them. Firstly, this style was only barely emerging at the time of creation of Pokémon Red and Green. And second, Jynx doesn't really reflect the image of Ganguro girls that much besides the hair. It's not like these girls were wearing blackface, but just really heavy spray tans. Unfortunately, it seems like we'll never know the specific reason as to why they designed Jynx to look like that. My guess is that they did actually want to go for the Ganguro style, but since the Game Boy had very limited colors at the artist's disposal, they chose black because it helped the blonde hair and other features stick out more. I don't really know, maybe this is a stretch, but that's all I got. Ultimately, I find it hard to believe that this was made with any racial stereotypes in mind though. Regardless, they changed Jynx's design to purple after a critic named Carol Boston Weatherford made a hit piece against characters like Jynx and Mr. Popo. Funnily enough, the latter's design was never changed, so shout out Mr. Popo I guess for standing his ground. Anyway, another example of Japan and America having distinctly different understandings of culture is the Game Corner. In the first Pokemon games, they would always have a Game Corner that essentially acted as a casino. You could buy chips with money, money and use it to gamble in the slot machines. I mean, they literally make it so you have to hear a man say he lost everything to gambling before you yourself are able to play it. While America certainly is a gambling-centric country, we tend to keep the kids out of it. This controversy is actually one that wasn't really brought up by Americans though, and it actually was something that was tolerated for quite a while until Game Freak had to deal with European age rating problems. It's one of those things that wasn't really a problem at the time, but in hindsight, maybe it would have been better to keep the concept of gambling away from young children. Fortunately, the games in the Game Corner themselves have pretty much been unrewarding, especially in Gen 1, so I doubt many kids at all developed real addictions out of it. The final topic of controversy that I feel truly defined Pokemon in the late 90s was the morality behind it. While this would be discussed a lot more in the future, particularly in the 5th generation of Pokemon, the concept of capturing animals and making them fight each other was still a little unsettling for some. Not only this, but certain religious groups even found the game's concept to be tied to Satanism, Darwinism, and Zionism. This is obviously stupid, and anyone who knew the origin story of Tajiri wouldn't have thought this, but hey, extremist groups will always say things like this to push their own agendas.
Well, there are many other controversies regarding the first generation of Pokemon, particularly lawsuits. I don't want to talk about the negatives anymore, because this time in particular was so positively impactful for the gaming world.
After the success of Pokemania, Nintendo followed up by releasing Pokemon Gold and Silver, games that expanded greatly upon the originals, featuring a brand new region, Pokemon, and mechanics. The anime, trading card game, and merchandise only continued to grow over time, all of which are bigger than ever today. Pokemon emerged from the mind of someone who wanted to recreate their childhood that he once lost to industrialization and give that same feeling to kids across the world. Sure, maybe the first generation of Pokemon wasn't the greatest, the gameplay was unbalanced, and the graphics were pretty awful even during that time, but the greatest impact of these games was never the gameplay, it was the culture. If you want to experience the best version of Kanto, you have remakes with games like Pokemon Fire Red or Pokemon Let's Go, but there's something about the original games that can't be replicated. It's a unique experience that you just had to be there to understand, something that I myself could never comprehend due to my younger age. But you know what, I am glad that both kids and adults still love Pokemon just as much as ever. Today, you'll see people in their 40s at the same Pokemon events as 10-year-old kids, which is really awesome when you think about how long of a time frame Pokemon has dominated pop culture for.
Do I necessarily recommend Pokemon Red and Blue today? Probably not. But whether the original games are actually good or not doesn't really matter, because the games we do have today wouldn't be here without them.